Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining on. We're going to give it a moment or so for people to join on the line, and then we'll get started. Talk to you guys soon. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining on to our National HoUSed campaign call. I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're going to go ahead and get started. I hope everyone had a restful July 4th weekend. And thank you for being flexible about a change in our schedules that we're holding this call today and not typically on the Mondays that we hold it. So as you know, this is our National HoUSed campaign call. Our HoUSed campaign focuses on advancing anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale sustained investments and reforms that are needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. We launched this campaign with all of you because we recognize that more than ever, we need bold policies to ensure that the people with the lowest incomes and those who are the most marginalized have a stable, affordable home. On our call today, we're going to hear from advocates across the nation and learn much more about some opportunities for engagement. We also have on our call many of you participants, which include homeless shelter and service providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income individuals who are receiving or in need of federal assistance, people experiencing homelessness, philanthropy, media, and many others. We welcome all of you to our call today. Thanks for joining. I'm really excited to go forward with our agenda today. We have a number of experts who are joining us. We're going to hear from Ariel Nelson from the National Consumer Law Center, who's going to talk a little bit about a new rule from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and what that means for tenant screening services. We'll hear from Maritza Crossan from the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, or known as CHAPA, who's going to provide an update on emergency rental assistance. And we'll hear from Angelica Moran from the Idaho Asset Building Network, who will give an update from the field. I'm going to start off with an update on what's going on Capitol Hill. But before I do that, I just want to remind folks that they can ask questions in the Q&A box. It's a lot easier for us to track your questions and therefore to ask them to our speakers if you do it in the Q&A box rather than in the chat box. So I just want to flag that for folks. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can on today's call. And we will be sharing a copy of our PowerPoint presentation and any other materials that are talked about on today's call. We'll share that with you in the coming days so that you have it available for you. I'm going to get started first with our update on what's happening on Capitol Hill. We could go to the next slide. That'd be great. And the slide after that too. I want to first talk about what's happening with budget reconciliation in the bill. We've talked in Congress. We've talked about this a lot over the last year or so. This week, Congress is on recess for the July 4th holiday, but negotiations are still happening around a scaled down reconciliation bill. We know that Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Schumer, who is the Senate leader, are continuing to have close conversations about the details of what could be in the bill. We know, very clearly the clock is ticking on the time that they have to reach some sort of an agreement. I think we mentioned before on past calls that in order for them to get through what is a very lengthy and sort of cumbersome process through the House and Senate, they really would need to reach some sort of an agreement on more specifics by the end of this July 4th recess. We have heard that even though, so knowing that they have a short time frame to reach a deal, we've heard that even if they do reach a deal, it may be that they hold their cards close to their chest and they don't make that publicly known. They'll want to keep it quiet for as long as possible, in part to avoid criticisms from Republican members, and also to make sure that it's less likely that any Democrats fall off of the bill. So they'll want to keep that agreement, if they reach one, as close as possible until they have to make it publicly known. As you know, nearly every single Democrat in the House and every single Democrat in the Senate is needed to pass a reconciliation bill. So they're going to be very cautious about when they make those details known. And my guess is that they're only going to release details once they feel like things are really fully baked, and that there's less opportunity for things to fall apart. I think politically, if they're able to reach an agreement, it's likely that they're going to bring that to the Senate floor right up against the August recess, which starts at the end of the month. In part, that's because part of the process of passing a reconciliation bill is this thing called vote-a-rama, where Senate Republicans can offer unlimited amendments on the bill. Many of these amendments, if not most of them, are going to be written to force Democrats into a tough position, to force them to take a vote on really tough, divisive issues, as part of their attempt to break up support for the bill and maybe prevent it from moving forward. So by holding a vote on reconciliation right up against the August recess, that's Democrats' way of trying to discourage Republicans from going on too long with their vote-a-rama. I've heard that we could see the first week of August recess be canceled. That would again give them more time to reach an agreement, go through the legislative process, and go through that vote-a-rama process. So we shall see if that happens. But that's what I'm hearing as a possibility. In terms of how close they are to a deal or what's included, it's not entirely clear to me. A lot of those details have been kept very close to the chest. They haven't been making it publicly known. But there are a few developments that have been happening in the last couple of weeks that I think point to them being closer and closer to reaching a deal. One, the Supreme Court ruling last week on limiting the ability of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions means that there's more pressure on Manchin and Schumer to reach a deal on the climate and energy provisions of the bill. That Supreme Court case means that the administration is more hamstrung in their ability to tackle climate change. So there's going to be more interest from the administration, I think, to try to reach a deal on that. The second thing that makes me think that they're closer to a deal than they have been in the past is that Senator McConnell recently threatened to kill a bipartisan bill called the Competes Act, which is focused on making the US more competitive with China. He threatened to kill that bill if Democrats do in fact pass a reconciliation bill. I don't think McConnell would have issued a threat like that if he thought reconciliation weren't going to go anywhere. He's trying to use his leverage to stop the bill from moving forward. But I think that's a good indication that there might be a path forward here. We do know the basic framework that Senator Manchin and Schumer have been using for negotiations. We've talked about that before too, about how they're looking at increasing taxes on corporations and high income earners. They're looking at ways to get savings from lowering drug prices. And they want to put a significant share of that money into deficit reduction and direct spending, which includes climate and energy provisions, healthcare, et cetera. I think it's going to be very challenging, but we want to keep pushing for the targeted housing investments in a reconciliation bill. We've talked about before how our top priorities are the targeted provisions that were in the House bill, and that includes $25 billion to preserve to expand rental assistance, $65 billion to preserve public housing, $15 billion in the National Housing Trust Fund to build another 150,000 homes for people with the lowest incomes. I'm sharing with you here on the PowerPoint, which you'll get later, a link to a really great article or interesting article about how inflation is already pushing more households into homelessness. I think that this is the sort of article that's really effective for you to be sharing with your member of Congress. We know that if the if the reconciliation bill is really being framed around inflation, there's a really clear connection here with, sorry, I'm going to share it in the chat box since folks asked for that. Oh, thank you, Sid. Sid shared that. Great. There's a clear connection between rising housing costs and inflation. And this sort of an article, I think, really underscores why we need those sorts of investments. I know I've shared it with offices, but I encourage you guys to do the same too. In that article, they found that 15 states are already reporting an increase in homelessness, and that wait lists have either doubled or tripled in just a matter of a few months. I think it really is sobering, and it's the sort of information that your congressional staffers need to know about. I also want to encourage folks that when you're reaching out to your members of Congress, it's not enough for them to say that they just support housing investments. What we really want is them to commit to weighing in with Senator Schumer, weighing in with Speaker Pelosi and the White House in support of these resources. I'm going to move on to appropriations, which is the next slide, please. Just to say that Congress is in the midst of passing or working on their appropriations bill. Appropriations is the process that they go through every year to fund defense and domestic programs, including housing programs. You may know that last month, the House released their draft spending bill for FY23. Last week, the Appropriations Committee voted to approve the bill, which means it'll now go to the House floor. You can read our full analysis of the spending bill in the link that I'm sending to you right now in the chat box. You can also check out our budget chart that has some other details that you might want to check out. I just wanted to note a couple of things that are important about this House bill. One is that it really provides significant funding for housing programs at about $63 billion for HUD. That's 17% more than last year. It's even $1 billion more than the president's budget request, which was also very robust. So it's very, very generous. One of the things that we think are most important about the bill is that it includes 140,000 new vouchers for the Housing Choice Voucher Program and funding increases for nearly every program. But the important thing for you to know is that this is not final. This is really a high water mark for what we can achieve in the FY23 spending bill. And that's because this is a bill that was written entirely by Democrats in the House. Eventually, they're going to have to negotiate on the Senate side with Republicans. And that's because any appropriations bill requires 60 votes in the Senate, which means that this is really the most of what we can achieve. And so we need to be continuing to keep up our advocacy with all members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, about why we need to have as much funding as possible for housing programs. I think it's very likely that we're going to see a continuing resolution, a CR, which will help keep the government open past October 1, which is the start of the new fiscal year. That continuing resolution may keep things open until November or December, and that gives Congress a little bit more time after the midterms to come up with a final spending bill. So we have about 5 months ahead of us for advocacy around an appropriations bill. So I want to encourage you all to sign on to our national letter. A link is in the chat box. Sending it now. It's also in this document, but also to keep up your advocacy with your members of Congress. It's very easy for us to get, we've been focused on the reconciliation bill. There are lots of other bills that are moving. One thing we know is that Congress has to pass an appropriations bill every year, and we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of that and seeing the highest increases of funding possible for HUD. There are two other bills I just wanted to flag for you and to ask your support on. Next slide, please. A major priority for us is the Eviction Crisis Act, which is S2182. It's a bipartisan bill that has been introduced by Senator Bennett and Portman. It essentially would create a permanent funding source for emergency rental assistance. I know we've heard from many of you who are already seeing ERA funds run out in your communities. There are programs that are already shutting down. This bill is really the long-term solution that we need to provide ongoing assistance, emergency rental assistance to help keep households stably housed and avoid eviction. So I'm sharing with you, again, there's lots of resources today. I'm sharing with you in the chat box a link to our sign-on letter. I'd love to encourage you to sign on, to share it with your networks, to share it with other folks, so we can get as many supporters as possible. And then also to please reach out to your senators, especially if you have a Republican senator, and ask them to co-sponsor the bill. We really want to build up the bipartisan support for this bill, because that's really the only way that it can move forward. And then lastly, I just wanted to give a shout out to, for the next slide, for the Fair Housing Improvement Act. Again, a major priority for the House campaign. This is a bill that's from Senator Kaine and Representative Peters that would ban discrimination on the basis of a household source of income. It would also ban discrimination based on military or veteran status. I know many of us are seeing increased challenges using housing vouchers in communities, and many times landlords discriminate against households that have a voucher, or they use it as a proxy for racial discrimination. This is a bill that would expand the Fair Housing Act and would prevent households from, or prevent landlords from discriminating. That would make it a lot easier for people to use their voucher and for other sorts of assistance. So I want to encourage you again, please ask your senators and representatives to co-sponsor the bill. It might be challenging to get Republicans onto this one, although we have had Republican support in past Congresses. We want to make as strong of a case for these two bills going forward. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to look into the chat box to see if folks have questions about anything that I've given an update on. There's one question who said, what's the impact of Senator McConnell saying that Republicans won't support that bipartisan competes bill if Democrats move forward with reconciliation? I think it's really hard to know the exact impact. Clearly, his intent is to make it even more difficult for Senator Manchin to reach an agreement with Senator Schumer. I take it as a good sign that maybe they're close to a deal, and this is sort of a last-ditch effort that McConnell is trying to do to thwart that. But we'll have to see going forward what the long-term impacts of it is. I'm definitely watching that as this bill moves forward. I'm also seeing a question about whether or not we could pass the Fair Housing Improvement Act this year. This is the bill I mentioned earlier that would ban discrimination based on source of income. I think there's a possibility here to do that, but it might become easier to pass next year. The reason why I say that is because any bill that moves forward other than the reconciliation bill needs 60 votes in the Senate. And so if we're able to build enough congressional support for this bill, if we're able to get some moderate Republicans on as co-sponsors, then I think there's an opportunity here to move that forward. And then I do see a question about having access to the slides, and we will make sure that folks have that. Okay, so I'm going to move forward with the rest of our agenda. Our next speaker, if you move to the next slide, please, and the one after that, is Ariel Nelson from the National Consumer Law Center, who's going to share with us a little bit more about the CFPB's new rule on tenant screening. Ariel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah, for having me. Today, like Sarah said, I'm going to talk a little bit about this new interpretive rule from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I will give everyone a heads up that what I'm about to say might be a little bit wonky, but I'm going to try to keep it high level and have some takeaways that are most relevant to tenant screening and to all of you. So to make sure we're really all on the same page to start out, I just want to really briefly explain what the CFPB is talking about, and that is a specific interpretation or interpretation of specific provisions of a federal statute that's called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And that statute imposes requirements concerning the creation and use of consumer reports. And a tenant screening report is usually a consumer report. And so that's why tenant screening is covered by this rule. It falls under the scope of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And the key question that's being asked in this new interpretive rule is, what is the preemptive scope of this particular part of the Fair Credit Reporting Act? And even that question is wonky and hard to understand. And that's partially because preemption, which at the highest level is the idea that a state can't regulate something because a federal law displaces it. And preemption under the Fair Credit Reporting Act is really complicated and difficult to understand, even for those of us who spend a lot of time reading these specific provisions. So please bear with me. So that's the question that's being asked. And I just want to quickly note, I've been throwing around the word interpretive rule, and that's a type of guidance from an agency, basically. This rule did not go through notice and comment rulemaking under the APA. So it's a little bit different than something you might be familiar with. So to give a little bit more background, before we dive into more detail, I just want to say that the sort of bottom line from this interpretive rule is that the CFPB is saying that the express preemption provisions of this statute have a, quote, narrow and targeted scope, and that states can pass laws having to do with consumer reporting. And you might be asking, well, why does this matter? This is some weird language. And part of why it matters so much is that the consumer reporting industry has been saying that states can't regulate the content of a consumer report at all, that they can't regulate the content of a tenant screening report at all. And we've been finding that even when the state law has been carefully crafted to avoid preemption under this statute, we're still seeing industry making these arguments. And that's really affecting states' willingness to enact certain laws governing tenant screening. And so you may have seen in the last couple of years in particular, we've been focusing on regulating the use of tenant screening reports by landlords instead of, for example, directly regulating what a tenant screening company can put on a report. But we think that that is a less effective approach because once information, say, about an eviction is on a consumer report, on a tenant screening report, it's a lot harder to enforce the prohibition on a landlord using it. And so this is a really big deal because the CFPB is saying, nope, according to us, states, you can regulate the content of a consumer report. So I just want to back up and then get into the weeds just a little bit. So there is a general preemption rule in the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which I've included here. I've included the site, and then I've included what the CFPB says about it, which is generally that state laws that are not inconsistent with the federal law, which includes state laws that are more protective of consumers than the federal law, are generally not preempted. So that's sort of the baseline we're talking about here. But then there are various specific provisions that have to do with preemption. And we call that express preemption. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA, also expressly preempts certain categories of state laws. And I want to just point out the two types of express preemption that the CFPB is focusing on here. I've mostly done that in case you want to look at them. Oh yes, I see someone asking about a link to the rule, and yes, let me drop it into the chat right now. So I mostly am including these two provisions just so you can see what they are. I don't want to get too much into the weeds of exactly the meaning of all of the words, which the CFPB does in the rule. And if you're interested, I highly recommend reading it. But I just want to say generally that one of these sections, 1681 TB1, preempts only those state laws with respect to any subject matter regulated under certain sections or subsections. And then another one, 1681 TB5, preempts only those state laws with respect to the conduct required by certain provisions of certain sections or subsections. And so like another bottom line takeaway from that is the CFPB is saying those two provisions, which are really difficult to understand, have a narrow and targeted scope. Preemption under this act is not as broad as had been argued by industry in particular. So I want to talk about the key takeaways from that first provision that I mentioned to you. And at the highest level, what the CFPB is saying is that this particular section does not preempt all state laws relating to the content or information contained in consumer reports. And that's really important because that goes back to exactly what I was saying before about, if a state wants to decide that certain eviction information should not appear on a report, the CFPB says, yes, state, you can pass a law saying that, and this federal law won't preempt that. And also that's pretty much what I just said, which is that the state laws relating to what or when items generally may be initially included on a consumer report, or what or when certain types of information may initially be included, would generally not be preempted. So before I get into some key takeaways with respect to tenant screening in particular, excuse me, I just want to give kind of one example of fleshing this out that gets a little wonky, so bear with me. But like I said, this particular provision and one section of it, 1681 TB1E, preempts state laws with respect to any subject matter regulated under another section, section 1681C, which relates to information contained in consumer reports. Excuse me. And that section, 1681C, lists requirements relating to 4 topics relating to information contained in reports, including obsolescence. Excuse me, which means how long certain specific types of information may continue to appear on a consumer report. And what the CFPB says about this is that only subject matter at this level of specificity is subject to preemption. So just to back up again, you have to get into the weeds so much to figure out what is preempted. It's not just that everything that appears on a report is preempted. Excuse me. So one example of how this plays out that is particularly relevant for this group, I think, is that section 1681C talks about how long specific types of information can continue to appear on a consumer report. But it doesn't regulate what or when items generally may be initially included. So part of what's in section 1681C is it talks about how long adverse items of information other than records of convictions of crimes may appear on a consumer report, but not whether or when adverse items may initially appear. So you might be thinking, what does that mean? So if we're talking about, say a state says, I don't want certain types of non-conviction criminal records to appear on a consumer report, that state could say, now, according to the CFPB, the state could do that. It could say, I don't want this type of information to appear at all, and that would be fine. So that was starting to get in a little bit more of the specific takeaways about tenant screening. But not just with respect to criminal records, the CFPB is also saying that states can pass laws addressing the furnishing and reporting of rental excuse me, information. And the CFPB specifically says a state law prohibiting a consumer reporting agency from including information or certain types of information about a consumer's eviction, rental arrears, or arrests would generally, excuse me, not be preempted. And so I just want to hammer home that this is big because, excuse me, states now have a lot more ability to make decisions about the types of things that are usually barring people from getting housing, like rental debt and eviction records, like we've been seeing so much during the pandemic. I also want to just mention a couple other very helpful tidbits that aren't as much about the interpretation of the statutory provisions as much as just like little things that could be useful in your advocacy. in your advocacy. One is the rule talks about consumer complaints related to rental debt and inaccurate information on reports. And it also has this really great quote that I've put in bold here. So sorry, everyone. I know, I apologize for my congestion going on. But the CFPB says, there is little or no empirical research showing that tenant screening report content is reliably predictive of future tenant behavior. And in my advocacy, I run into a lot of states saying, you know, well, what is isn't this predictive? Isn't a tenant screening report and all of its contents useful? And the CFPB has helped us out a little bit by saying there isn't research that shows this. So I was particularly excited to see this. I just want to quickly mention the other provision that I initially cited, because even though it's a little less directly relevant to tenant screening, thanks everyone for your kind words. So this particular, the key takeaway with this provision has to do with a battle that's going around in terms of advocates trying to get consumer reporting agencies to provide disclosures like a copy of your report in a different language. And there's litigation on this currently in New Jersey. And the CFPB has come out and said that if a state law required that a consumer reporting agency provide information required by the federal law at the consumer's requests in languages other than English, such a law would generally not be preempted. So to the extent any of you are working on those types of language access issues, this can also be a help as well. So the other quick tidbit I wanted to mention is that the CFPB is encouraging state officials to consult with it if there's a situation where there's a challenge to a state law based on preemption under the FCRA. And they dropped a footnote in their rule saying that New Jersey actually had reached out to them about the case I mentioned before, and they're saying, we like to see that, please do it more. So if you are in a state where there's a challenge to a law, encourage probably your state AG's office to reach out to the CFPB. They're looking out for these consultations and are welcoming them. So I kind of want, before I open it up to questions, I want to kind of make a few concluding points. I know that was a lot really quickly, and you had to deal with my my coughing, for which I'm very sorry. But the bottom line, like I've said, is that the CFPB has strongly stated that the scope of preemption is narrow and that the states can, for example, regulate the content of consumer reports like eviction information or rental debt information that could go into them. I think this is really exciting for advocates because we can now tell states that they can regulate tenant screening companies directly. But I do want to say that there is still some risk of a legal challenge to those types of laws, and a risk that a court wouldn't give much weight to this interpretive rule. And that's partially because everything is in flux now with the Supreme Court and what it's doing in the area of administrative law. But I will say that short of a rule that goes through the notice and comment rulemaking, which is what we have here, an interpretive rule, this is pretty strong authority, and we think that advocates should take advantage of it. And I'll also say that New Jersey has already filed a notice with the court in its case, saying that, pointing out the rule to the court and saying that the CFPB's analysis is well reasoned and it should get considerable weight, and that it's consistent with the language of the statute. So, we hope that this rule will be helpful for advocates as they're trying to draft and get bills passed. And also, if there is a legal challenge, helpful to the litigants as they're trying to protect the rule. And I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Ariel. I know it's a challenging, complicated legal issue, but I think there's a lot of good takeaways here for advocates who are doing work, especially at the state and local level. I'm wondering, so for some examples, this might open the door. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that it opens the door if a state advocacy group wanted to pass a law in their state that said consumer reports cannot include any information about eviction filings if it doesn't actually result in a judgment against the renter. Or if you wanted to pass a state law that said you can only include eviction data for 3 years and then it has to be expunged from the consumer report. Are those the sorts of things that could be allowed under this new rule?
So I would say to the first example you gave, yes, definitely. Yes, a state could, using this rule, say that they can, a tenant screening company can't report an eviction filing if it resulted in a judgment in favor of the tenant. Yes. The second one is a little bit trickier because of a concept that I briefly mentioned earlier during one of my coughing fits, so you may have missed it, but it has to do with obsolescence. So I think the safest bet is more like the first option that you gave, Sarah. The second one, you might run into problems because the obsolescence provision of the statute designates certain amounts of time that certain information can be reported for. And if say an eviction record is just allowed to be reported, it can be reported for 7 years. And I think you would still run into a preemption problem if you tried to mess with that. But you could still say certain kinds of eviction information can't be reported at all. And your state could also pass an eviction sealing law, which would be separate and also wouldn't be a concern in the preemption space. So I think you could still attack that problem in 2 different ways.
That's awesome. I also had a question about the CFPB inviting state officials to reach out to them. I think of that as also being a really helpful thing for advocates to know is available to them. So if, for example, they're hearing from state officials who might be worried about a pending lawsuit or worried about how a court might interpret this, that could be a useful resource for advocates to help connect their state officials with the CFPB. I'm wondering if that's your interpretation of it too, that could be a helpful resource, or have you seen that happen?
Yes, I definitely think so. I think, like I mentioned, the CFPB actually called out New Jersey and said, New Jersey reached out to us. It was great. We want to see more of that. So I think that's a green light for states when they're seeing arguments about state laws that bump up against things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, that's within their jurisdiction. They want to know about it, and they probably have something to say about it.
Awesome. And I think there's also a question here, which I also want to know too, is other than the New Jersey example, are there other states that are looking at regulations around their tenant screening or consumer reporting? What sort of examples of things that they're doing?
So there have been a lot of recent laws dealing with tenant screening. There's a DC one that was just passed recently that's pretty broad in scope. There's also one in Philadelphia and a number of states. And those are just to name a couple of the strongest examples I can think of off the top of my head. And I saw another question in the Q&A that was, can you give us the best example of model language? And I would say the 2 laws I just mentioned are that, Philadelphia and DC. However, those laws were passed in a world where we didn't have this interpretive rule. And so those laws really just regulate the use of a consumer report by a landlord. And that, like I said, is, I think, less strong than if you're directly regulating the tenant screening company and what can go into the tenant screening report. And so now I think the world has changed, and the advice we might give about what a model law should look like would be very different. And so I think we're still trying to figure out what that would look like. And I mean, I think especially if you're in certain jurisdictions, like probably the Fifth Circuit, I would be maybe a little more worried about. But if you're in the First Circuit or the Second Circuit, or certain states that might be certain places where your courts might be less likely to not go for the CFPB's interpretation, then I think it's a game changer. I think you can try directly regulating the tenant screening company.
So that's great. I think that what that means is what we need to follow back up with you in a couple of months to see how advocates are using this new flexibility, what sort of rules are coming out of it. So I look forward to hearing back from you. Thanks so much for joining. I know it's a legal, complicated issue, but we really appreciate your expertise.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Absolutely. We're going to turn now to our next speaker, Maritza Croson from Citizens Housing and Planning Association, or CHAPA. Maritza, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. As Sarah said, I'm Maritza Croson with Citizens Housing and Planning Association. We are a nonprofit advocacy organization for affordable housing. And I'm going to talk to you today about, we're part of the ERASE project with NLIHC, and we have our own emergency rental assistance grant program that's kind of a subset of what the state of Massachusetts is doing. So just to give a background on, for those that aren't familiar with our organization, as I mentioned, we're a statewide policy and advocacy organization with the mission to encourage the production and preservation of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families and individuals, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. We accomplish our work through 3 pillars: advocating for opportunity through our policy work, expanding access to housing through our program work, and developing in the field through our forums and our trainings. So before getting into our own grant program, which is, again, a small subset of what the state of Massachusetts is doing, I just want to give you a brief overview of what the state looks like as a highlight. On March of 2021, Massachusetts launched the Federal Emergency Rental Assistance Program, also known as ERAP, which provided expanded rental relief to eligible tenants alongside with our existing program that we have in the state of Massachusetts called RAFT. We received a total of $457 million in Massachusetts, and we were also able to provide nearly $100 million in additional funding and streamline the application process that allowed landlords with 20 or fewer units to apply, as well as with tenant consent. And the ERAF benefit was just a little bit more than the RAF, actually substantially more than the RAF benefit for the clients, and a little bit more flexible. So we were thrilled to be able to offer this program. It is administered by 9 housing consumer education centers in Massachusetts. We call them HCECs. They're kind of scattered all over the state, really covering every region, but there are only 9 of them. They're pretty large organizations, and they were already tasked with overseeing the RAF program, so it just made sense to have the ERAF program also fall under them. They already had the systems and the processes in place. However, capacity quickly became an issue because we were getting such an influx of applicants due to the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. So all of them quickly ramped up staff and created really efficient processes. But again, they're scattered about, and they're large organizations. They're not on the ground working in communities as a nonprofit or a community-based organization would. So we were really aware of the issue that there may be some populations that aren't being met by these 9 regional agencies. So with that in mind, CHAPA CEO created a grant proposal that we presented to our board to allow us to tap into our own funding to hopefully fund the CBOs for their work. So we created a pilot program to support the CBOs in our shared goal of preventing evictions and foreclosures due to the pandemic. Like I mentioned, we know that many households may be unaware of the assistance, may not be getting the outreach from the state agencies, may need help applying or have other questions. And so cognizant of the dire need to reach these households at this time, so this was in October and November of 2021, we provided funds to the CBOs, who are the trusted and reliable resources within their communities, to help with their efforts to help people apply for financial assistance. Our main program goals were essentially to just prevent unnecessary foreclosures and evictions and homelessness at the greatest extent possible. And really help provide a program that directly leverages and supports the robust work of the CBOs that have those vital connections to the homeowners and tenants within their communities that are already working with these households and are not being paid to do so or are not being trained to do so. So we wanted to fund them and train them to supplement the work that our regional agencies were also doing. Our secondary goal was also, while we have these groups that we're working with, was to really document how they do the work that they do, what makes a community-based organization special and unique in capturing these households. We wanted to be able to document the challenges that the people are facing that are coming to the doors of CBOs. And is it because of language access? Is it because of lack of knowledge of the programs? Is it because of technology issues? What are the CBOs able to provide that the larger state organizations aren't able to capture? We also wanted to create an area where we could have some knowledge sharing. So we had 22 agencies in our cohort, and we wanted to create an environment where we could have monthly meetings and they would come together to share best practices, tips, outreach methods, trainings that they were participating in, and troubleshooting difficult client cases, as well as provide trainings from the state agencies directly for these groups as well. Aware that this was a really strong need, we were really lucky to have two partner agencies join us on this mission. The Boston Foundation and United Way came in as partners on this grant program, and CHAPA was able to more than double the number of grantees we were able to participate in this program. So our original goal was to have 10 grantees, and with the funding contributions from United Way and the Boston Foundation, we were able to more than double that. So we had 22 grantees in our cohort, and each grantee received a grant of about $30,000 to $40,000 for a 6-month period. So the grant was from December of 2021 through May of 2022. Now I want to get into a little client data in the next phase of the program, which will be a research component. So as I mentioned, our secondary goal was really to document what makes the CBOs special and unique in this environment and what allows them to reach households that our state agencies and our regional agencies are not able to reach. And so we asked them to send us monthly reporting. We wanted to be very clear that we weren't trying to overburden any of the agencies that already we knew were short-staffed and underfunded. So really we told them to send in whatever they had and we would make it work. And so we were able to gather a lot of great information to really capture what makes these groups unique, what makes their clients unique. So from December to April 2022, so for a 5-month period, these 22 grantees were able to help almost 1,600 clients, the majority of which were tenants and the majority of which were looking for rental assistance. We also had about 20% of these clients looking for utility assistance, and a small percentage were also looking for assistance for their mortgage relief. While we were launching our program, coinciding the HAF program, the Homeowners Assistance Fund also launched. So slowly we were working with less and less clients that needed mortgage relief as they were being sent over to the groups in our state that were working on the HAF program. The average request from their clients was about $4,000, and the total request just for that 5-month period for these 22 grantees was $3.5 million. The next few slides are really going to get into that unique touch that the CBOs have that are getting to the clients that we knew were underserved. So we did ask how they found out about the assistance or how they learned about the community-based organization and that they could help them. 63% of the clients that our CBOs served said that they learned about the assistance either because a community member referred them directly to the CBO or because the outreach that the CBO did on their own. So that was telling us that the outreach that was being conducted by the state or the regional agencies was not reaching these households. I should mention again, this was in December of 2021 through April of 2022, and the ERAP program had already been around for almost a year at that point. And the clients that we were seeing weren't newly in arrears. They had definitely had 4 or 5 months for the most part that they owed on back rent or utilities or a combination of the two. So we were trying to figure out why had they not applied to this point, and how did they get to us? So it seems like being a trusted member in the community was definitely a strong component of this program for the CBOs, to say that my brother came to them for assistance, you can trust them. My neighbor used them, you can trust them. Word of mouth was really huge for these groups in terms of getting clients into their doors. We also asked the top 5 reasons that the clients had not applied or any barriers that they had faced. About a quarter of them just said they needed help applying. So I should have mentioned that the main method of applying for ERAP in our state's system was through our state's website. You could go on and apply on your own and submit the website online, or you could call a hotline and someone would do it with you over the phone. However, as we know, there's a lot of follow-up and back and forth after just submitting that application. There's some paperwork that they needed. There may be a signature that was missing. And so there's a lot of back and forth that requires tracking. You also need to have an email address that not everyone has. And also you need to have access to technology and speak or read in the language that is being provided at the application. And so many of the clients that were working with the CBOs just purely needed to sit with someone and help them for these many reasons, that they had a language barrier that was not being resolved. They had an immigration status that they did not feel comfortable going to a state website and filling out their personal information to submit off and have a stranger call them back asking for more information. They wanted to sit down with someone that they felt comfortable with and that they could trust. And technology barriers out as well. As I mentioned, if you don't have an email address, it's really hard to have that back and forth with the regional agency if they need to follow up, which they oftentimes do. We also wanted to know what other resources these clients were provided while they were with the CBO. It's not uncommon if someone is behind on their rent or utilities that they may be behind on other essential resources as well. And so about 21% of the clients needed SNAP, 16% needed utility assistance, 7% workforce development, 6% needed supportive housing, and 8% legal services. So this is again speaking to that special niche that the CBOs were able to fulfill. If someone is going onto a state website and filling in an application for rental assistance, they're not necessarily going to then receive all of these additional resources that they most likely need. They would have to go to 5 different agencies or start researching it themselves. It's incredibly overwhelming and time consuming. And the CBOs were really able to help make a household whole again and get them really back on their feet. So I want to dive into that. That was kind of the first component of our grant program. And that's the first 6 months where we're working directly with the CBOs and funding them directly to do this work. And in return, receiving this reporting so that we can gather information to make more informed policy recommendations. So the trajectory is that we would collect data and the stories from the CBOs, and now we're launching the second half of this phase where we're working with a researcher to provide an analysis on that information that the CBOs have given to us. And we're going to take that analysis and ourselves, CHAPA, as well as our funders, the Boston Foundation and United Way, will use that information to advocate for future funding for community-based organizations from state and federal governments, because it is not a sustainable program to have just a small nonprofit providing these one-time grants for these groups when we know that they're doing the work already and they're not being funded or trained to do the work. And so we want to kind of change the way that these policy recommendations are being formulated and learn from the CBOs themselves as well as their clients that they're serving directly. So we will be working with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We're kind of kicking off the research component this month. They are a regional planning organization in Massachusetts, as well as a researcher. And they will be doing research to understand, using the information that we provided, but also ongoing information that the CBOs will provide for us. But to learn the experiences of people in Massachusetts who did or do face housing instability, the work that the CBOs did to support housing programs throughout COVID and the successes and challenges they faced, the Massachusetts housing context as a whole, and then how to turn these experiences and ideas into a vision for housing policy in Massachusetts. So the work will really center around the experiences of the CBOs and the residents, not us as advocates and policymakers kind of dictating what we think is needed. We want the CBOs and their residents and their clients to tell us how they think that these programs should be working to help us create our advocacy plans for the future. And the focus will really be on the impacts of BIPOC, immigrant, and low-income household experiences. In addition to the data that we've already collected, we will have some stakeholder research groups. One will be the working group of the main funders, and the other will be a stakeholder group of various members. The CBOs will hold several seats in this group: emergency rental assistance recipients, landlords, housing program and policy advocates, municipal officials, and state agency representatives, just to name a few. We will be meeting on a consistent basis throughout the next 6 months. And we hope to have, from this information, as well as research that the team will be doing in the background of this, some great solid information in which to create our case going forward as to why programs like this need to be funded at the state and federal level, not at a small local level with, we're a small nonprofit of 15 people. Certainly not sustainable for us to fund these groups going forward. And it really just makes sense for them to be a part of the fabric of these programs going forward. Certainly based on the experience that we've had working with them and the impact that they have made on clients that have been the hardest hit by this pandemic. So we do hope to have some great policy recommendations to share with you in the future, probably again around the winter of or spring of 2023. And we'd love to come back and share that when that time comes.
Wonderful. Maritza, that's such a great overview. I do have a couple questions for you, and I'm going to encourage folks to enter their questions in the Q&A box too. You mentioned that the funding to support these community-based organizations were really funded from outside groups, philanthropy. Did you make an effort to try to convince folks to use federal dollars for this? How did that conversation go? Or did you think this approach was better because you needed to prove the value of it first before you went to state officials?
Well, we were aware of the timing of it. It needed to be a quick turnaround because we have already run out of, our ERAP funding is now already expended, and we had to close our applications as of May 15th. So we were working in a really short time frame of like December to May. We had to have the program launched. And so unfortunately, sometimes when you're adding in programs that at that quick of a pace with federal and state connections, we needed a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we were crafting it, how we wanted to have the reporting come in. As I mentioned, we were incredibly flexible about reporting because we didn't want anything to be overly burdensome just for the sake of collecting data, because that's what grantors do. We wanted to be really thoughtful about it and also aware of the constraints that the CBOs were working under. So we were very lucky to have the Boston Foundation and United Way also recognize this and come in with us. And that in itself was huge for us. And they're continuing with us and actually funding the research component, which was wonderful. And so going forward, that's the case that we're making, is that this should not be a philanthropic effort. It needs to be part of the 20% or whatever the admin fee should be going forward from a federal or state program, that a slice of that goes to a community-based organization. We actually tried to advocate for that when our HAF program was launching. And they are using CBOs, but only for outreach, not for the application process.
Okay. And I see a question from Rachel Gottwald, who's asking how you prioritize which households would receive this funding. And I'm wondering if you saw a difference in terms of the demographic information or income levels of those who were served through the CBOs versus on their own.
We saw every client that was coming to the CBOs was almost all of them were of extremely low income, so 30% or lower of the AMI. Also, a substantial amount, about 40%, were Black and Brown households. Many of them were single parent households, I would say over half. But I don't know, to be honest with you, how that lays out. The data that we're collecting was slightly different than what our state agencies were collecting. Some of it was a little bit more, some of it was different, so it's a hard comparison. So that's where the process that we're in right now with the researchers. But we didn't select the households, we selected the grantees, and that was based on an RFP that we submitted based on their ability to do kind of unique outreach, the clients that they already serve in their communities. We wanted to make sure that they met our criteria for being sort of hardest hit in terms of the pandemic and the economic crisis. And then they essentially served any household that came to their door that qualified for ERAP.
Great, that's super helpful to know. I know that there is a question from in the Q&A box about how are people who are recipients of this assistance being brought to the table in terms of helping you develop policy work going forward.
Yeah, so we're asking our CBOs to see if they do have any clients willing to work with us through the stakeholder table. They will certainly be funded or compensated for their time and their efforts, as will actually, I should mention, the community-based organizations will as well, because this is kind of an extension of the program. They were funded that $30,000 to $40,000 for the 6-month program that they were reporting on. And this is the next phase where we're asking the volunteers that have the capacity. Many have volunteered, thankfully, because we need their knowledge and their experience, and hopefully they're going to be bringing some of their clients to the table with them as well. But that has to be a very thoughtful process, and we want to make sure that we're being thorough about and intuitive about how, intentional about how we go about that. We're in that process right now, actually.
Great, and then I have a question too about the RAFT program. So this is your ongoing emergency rental assistance program that was existing before the pandemic, before the ARPA funds. How is that funded on an ongoing basis? What sort of resources does your state use to put into that?
It's funded through the state, and I believe, I don't want to be quoted on this because I don't know the exact number. We just got about $100 million increase to cover through the end of last year because it was going so quickly, but it's not as flexible as ERAP. It has a $7,000 cap. You also can only be, you have to be 50% of the area median income or lower. So there's a lower income threshold, and you cannot receive more than $7,000 in a 12-month period. You can't come back. There's also other restrictions in terms of receiving rent going forward. It's all about having to be in the arrears, whereas the ERAP program is a little bit more flexible than that as well. So we're hoping to also take lessons learned from ERAP and say, look how much more this was able to help us and quickly get the money out the door instead of waiting for someone to be X amount of months behind on rent before they possibly can get rental assistance. Because the other issue, I'm sure as everyone can understand, is the time it takes to submit an application into getting payment in hand. That can be about an 8-week period. So there's an extra 2 months that you're possibly falling behind on rent or not buying food or medicine or whatever, the case may be.
That's really great to know. I'm glad to hear that you're sort of wanting to incorporate the lessons learned back into your existing program. I think that's super helpful. I want to thank you so much for joining with us. If there are other questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, I invite you to answer them on your own. But thank you for joining. I appreciate that. And we will go on to our next speaker, Angelica Moran from Idaho Asset Building Network, who's going to give us an update from the field. Angelica, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Angelica Moran, and I'm a policy specialist at the Idaho Asset Building Network. And here at the Idaho Asset Building Network, we aim to connect leaders, service providers, businesses, and consumers statewide to advance policies that support all Idahoans in achieving long-term financial security and by ensuring that they are able to access an affordable home here in our state. And again, a huge thank you to Sarah for just inviting us to speak on some of the work we are doing here in Idaho. So that's kind of what I'm here to talk about with you today. So last Tuesday, we hosted a congressional roundtable, and in our roundtable, we invited our multi-sector housing coalition members, and then we also invited our members of Congress. And our goal was really to educate our members of Congress on what Idaho's housing landscape looks like and the policies that are needed in order to create long-term housing solutions. So to really make sure this roundtable came together, we gave ourselves around 2 months to plan it, and that consisted of connecting with our congressional delegation, whether it was seeing if our Congress members themselves can join us or a staffer from their office. And then we also just connected with our housing working partners to see who would be able to make it to that meeting to really bring in the perspective of how housing truly impacts every aspect of our life. And just throughout those 2 months, we created different content and material. We created a list of participants that would be there and their contact information. That way, after the meeting, if our congressional delegation had more questions, they can connect with our coalition members. And then we also created like a one-pager for coalition members that talked about the policies we were going to talk about and talking points around that. And we also provided them with talking points about the sector that they would be talking about, just to make sure they had all the information they needed to be fully prepared, and just ensuring that they know how important it is that we include their voices and elevate their voices during that meeting. And then once we gathered a group of our coalition members that were able to come, we did have a planning meeting, and we just talked about kind of the structure for the meeting, answered any questions, provided them with all the information that they might need. When we invite our coalition members to work on our projects or our advocacy, we really try to make it as easy as possible on their end, since we know that they are working on other great projects and don't want to add more to their plate. So now for the actual roundtable, we had about 13 of our coalition partners make it, and some of them represented healthcare, some of them represented fair housing, independent state living, and just many more. And then we were able to have staffers from Senator Crapo's office, Senator Risch's office, and Congressman Fulcher's office. So pretty much our whole congressional delegation besides Congressman Simpson's office. So it was great to just see a turnout, and from each office we had at least 2 folks participate, and they were just very engaged in the conversation and asked a lot of great questions. So it was just amazing. And then in terms of kind of what entailed in our congressional roundtable and our topics, so my colleague Kendra and I, we really focused on putting down the foundation. So really talking about what Idaho's housing landscape looks like, really giving them the numbers and the data of what kind of Idahoans are currently facing when they're trying to access a home here in our state. And then I really dove into the long-term housing solutions that have been provided to us by the NLIHC. So we spoke on the importance of housing choice vouchers, the National Housing Trust Fund, and the creation of a permanent emergency rental assistance. And then besides talking about the importance of those programs, we related it back to current legislation that's trying to get passed in Congress. So we talked about those investments that Sarah mentioned earlier. So the budget reconciliation, the FY appropriations, and then the Eviction Crisis Act, and just elevated those policies by using those talking points that the NLIHC provides for us. And it was just really great. We didn't have an initial reaction from our congressional delegation about these specific legislation, but they did talk to us about other policies around housing that they're working on. So that is always great to hear. And we will just continue to follow up with them and ensuring that they are listening to us and making sure that we're elevating the voices of Idahoans here in our state as we, again, advocate for these policies that we know are much needed and very important in our state. So with that, Sarah, I think that is all for me, and I'll see if there's any questions.
Great, thanks so much for that. I'm going to encourage people to ask their questions in the Q&A box. I did want to say that there's a number of things that you did that feel like really good best practices. So for other folks on the line, if you're thinking about doing a roundtable with your members of Congress, some things that I thought were great were, one, that you gave yourself plenty of time to plan and work with other stakeholders, that you shared state-specific information, you related the issues to what was happening directly in your community, that you prepared materials in advance, worked out who was going to talk about what, you brought in lots of different stakeholders, and that you tied it all back to specific legislation. All of those are things I think that everybody could be doing when they're doing roundtables or in-person meetings with members of Congress that I think are really helpful. I see that Gina Wilt is asking a good question about did you hold, it sounds like you held one roundtable, but nearly all of your members of Congress were able to attend. Where in the state did you hold that?
Yeah, so we're still kind of balancing that virtual and in-person space. So we did do a virtual roundtable. Some of our federal delegation or congressional delegation, they're here working in Idaho, but then we also had 2 of their staffers that were in DC. So it was just able to connect from like both offices in that virtual space. And I think it went pretty well. Even like kind of managing the virtual space, I still feel like we had that interaction. And yeah, it was just that one congressional meeting, congressional roundtable, and everyone just joined at once.
Awesome. Good use of our Zoom technology here. Very cool. I have a question about the stakeholders that you brought in. Were they all housing experts, or were they stakeholders who work in other sectors?
So they were all housing experts. So they were the ones who kind of take on the housing policy work for each office. So that's who we have been just targeting during our advocacy to those congressional offices.
Awesome. Wonderful. And I see that there's a question in the chat box or in the Q&A box about where other folks can find the talking points that that you mentioned. And I see that Kim is sharing that information there, but I want to invite everyone else that if you're doing a roundtable event or in-person meetings, or inviting your members of Congress to go on tours of affordable housing development, you're welcome to reach out to any NLIHC staff, and we're happy to connect you with any talking points that might be helpful for you. Let's see if there's any other questions before we move on.
And
sorry, go ahead.
While we check for questions, yeah, just the NLIHC, you have all been great at providing those talking points. So just everything that you share on each policy is kind of what we've been using as our talking points. So just like a huge thank you for you and everyone on your team.
Our pleasure. Thanks for using them. It makes it a lot easier if we know that folks are using them in the field. Appreciate that. I just have one more question. What sort of follow-up did you do after the roundtable to stay engaged with those offices?
So for follow-up, we just send them again some of those fact sheets that we've been working on. So we sent them a fact sheet on like housing and child development, and just anything that we talked about during the meeting or specific information that they asked, we include that in the follow-up email. And then again, just like continuing our advocacy. So maybe like later in the month, write them a letter about a certain policy and just continuing that conversation that way.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers for joining today's call. It was really great to learn from all the great work that everyone's doing. We're going to end our call a little bit early today, and I'll see everybody in 2 weeks when we have our next call. Thank you guys so much for joining. Talk to you guys soon.